Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Brian Kaylor and Beau Underwood, authors of a new book titled Baptizing America, How Mainline Protestants Help Build Christian Nationalism from Chalice Press. Brian Kaylor serves as the chair of both the Communication Advisory Committee and the Resolutions Committee for the Baptist World Alliance and is editor and president of Word and Way. Brian is an award-winning writer and sought-after expert on issues of religion, politics, and communication. He also hosts the award-winning podcast, Baptist Without an Adjective. His writings have been published by CNN, Houston Chronicle, Kansas City Star, Religion News Service, Sojourner, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Washington Post, and many other outlets. He's the author of 4 books on religion and politics and also co-author of another. He has a PhD and an MA in Communications from the University of Missouri and a BA in Communications and Christian Ministry from Southwest Baptist University. Beau Underwood is senior pastor of Allisonville Christian Church, Disciples of Christ in Indianapolis, Indiana, where I used to live many years ago. Besides pastoring congregation, he has led the advocacy efforts of faith-based organizations in Washington, D.C., helped steer an award-winning journalistic ministry, staff congressional campaigns, served as a community organizer, and worked as a hospital chaplain. A proud alum of Eureka College, the University of Chicago Divinity School, and the University of Chicago's Harris Public School of Policy, he is currently a doctoral candidate at the University of Missouri's Truman School of Government and Public Affairs. His writing has appeared in Sojourners, Christian Century, Religion and Politics, and Word and Way, where he is a contributing editor. And so you can learn more about the book at chalicepress.com. So congratulations, gentlemen, on all your wonderful work. And thanks so much for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So is there anything else besides what I mentioned that you'd like people to know about each of you?
That was pretty exhaustive, but I think the thing that pops out is in addition to all of our professional roles and all of the work we've done on this book, we're actually quite good friends. Indeed, the way this book kind of got started is we met on social media first. I was in Washington, D.C. working at Sojourners, and Brian was a professor in Virginia. And he had moved to Jefferson City, Missouri, the state capital of Missouri. You'll remember from your 6th grade state capitals quiz. And I announced that I was going to be moving there too to take a church. And he hit me up on social media. We started doing lunch together, trying to solve all the world's problems, and quickly realized we had this passion for religion and politics, and started talking, then started writing together, and pretty soon we're doing this book. So we come at it not just from really wanting to create this conversation, but from the joy of getting to do something, 2 friends working together on a passion project.
Very cool. Very cool. Brian, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think both covered it well. I mean, we have both come at this topic and broader issues with, backgrounds, as you highlighted, in issues of political communication, public policy, and we both also have the religion side. So, we love to talk about religion and politics, and they say you're not supposed to do that at dinner conversations, so I guess you shouldn't invite us over for supper, but we're happy to talk about the topic here online.
Well, good for you, first of all, and so am I. I mean, I think that, I grew up in corporate America where you're not supposed to talk about religion, politics, or sex, right? So as a result, we are not good at talking about any of those things. And so, hopefully you've been able to spur some enlightenment and practice for those of us that need it. So you talked a little bit about how the book came about, but, I work with a lot of different authors, and I know how difficult it is to get a book published. So kind of how did the book, itself take form, and how did you decide to go with Chalice Press?
Yeah, so we've been writing together at a Substack called The Public Witness, which is publicwitness.wordandway.org. And we've been writing a lot on Christian nationalism for the last several years. In our side conversations, we talk about how all of the stuff that American evangelicals are doing and being blamed for was really rooted in a lot of mainline Protestant history. And we were just kind of waiting for somebody to name that and say that. And finally, after enough time passed and we didn't see it being added to the conversation, we drafted up an essay that was published by Religion and Politics, a publication of the John Danforth Center at Washington University in St. Louis. They kind of made this argument, and those 1,200 words got a really good response from the theologians, the historians, the sociologists who study Christian nationalism. And we took that to Chalice Press and said, we think we have something here. We'd like to expand this argument and turn it into a book. We did a lot more research, found a lot more evidence of our argument, and now Baptizing America exists in the world. And there's a lot of books on American evangelicals and Christian nationalism, like dozens. And there's exactly one book on mainline Protestants and Christian nationalism, and that's ours.
Well, I have to admit that kind of surprised me when I saw the title, because I've been blaming those evangelicals myself, for the big problem that we have. So what are some of the things that you uncovered that, led to this conclusion?
Yeah, I mean, there's several moments that we trace in the book, and they are things that the white evangelical leaders are pointing to today. I think the very last example, just as an example, the very last example that made it in the book, we were supposed to be turning in our manuscript, and Mike Johnson became Speaker of the House. And I go, we've got to address this, because I mean, he is a textbook example of someone who pushes Christian nationalism today in the political sphere. And there's that moment when he's elected, he's giving his first speech, and he points up above him to the words in gold letters, "In God we trust." And he basically makes this like justification for his religious political vision. And not only did he point to it during his speech and highlight it, it's his first social media post after his election. It's just a picture of those gold letters, "In God we trust." So, as I said, we read the book, like, it's basically done. We're supposed to be turning it in already. And so by this point, I have that thought of like, well, I wonder how they got there, because that's what we've been doing throughout. We'd be like, well, we have under God the pledge, we have God we trust as the national model. How did it get there? Mainline Protestants. And so we went into the record to see, well, when did that phrase get there? And it was, of course, it was mainline Protestant politicians. And it was in response to the Supreme Court decisions. When the Supreme Court, the decisions we often say, they kicked God out of school. 62 and 63 on school prayer and on Bible reading in public schools. And of course, as a side note, as ministers, we don't think that God is so small and impotent to be able to be forced out of a building by 9 people in black robes. But the members of Congress, as they're talking about this, they wanted a way to retort and rebut, right? Just to put their stamp on the nation and say, the Supreme Court said this, but we think we're a Christian nation. And so they tore down some gold stars off the wall of the House chamber and put in the gold letters, "In God we trust." Right? And so this is both proof of how mainline Protestants were trying to create us as a Christian nation and codifying all that, and then how it's now co-opted and used by conservative evangelicals today to justify their political vision.
And it's really that last thing I think that's so important, right, is we have the David Bartons of the world, these pseudo-evangelical historians that run around perpetuating this myth that America is a Christian nation that allows the Christian nationalism to, really intensify, right? That this idea that we're going to fuse these two identities in a way that really privileges some and makes others feel like they're less a part of our society. The data that these David Bartons of the world point to is all the stuff that mainline Protestants have done. So how do we know America is a Christian nation? Well, it's "In God we trust" on the wall in the Capitol. It's "Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. It's all these things that mainline Protestants did that David Barton and others point to. It's really quite astounding that we've neglected how we got here, and this book helps tell that story.
Well, just that, "In God we trust," was a surprise to me. I didn't realize that it was that recent. I thought it'd been on the coins forever, since the beginning of the country or whatever, so I was really surprised to learn that.
Yeah, right. And, Civil War, the Union puts it just on some money as basically this way of like stamping us, right? Like the Confederates were a Christian nation. They said so in their Constitution. And so some mainline Protestants in the North were like, oh no, God may not favor us. We may lose. So we put "In God we trust" on some money, but then it's not until we get to that revival, that Christian nationalist revival that happens in the late 40s and throughout the 50s, where it goes on all money, and it becomes the national motto. It goes on a stamp, and then eventually it goes on the wall of the House chamber. So yeah, It's surprising how new so much of this stuff is, and which undermines the idea we weren't intended to be a Christian nation. We were not founded as a Christian nation. But there was an effort in the middle of the last century by mainline Protestant clergy and politicians to make us a Christian nation.
Hmm. So the book's description says, Baptizing America critiques the concept of civil religion, arguing that such expressions are far more dangerous than we realize. So first, can you explain to folks what civil religion means, and then describe some of the most significant dangers?
Yeah, I'll let Brian jump in here, but just to name that this is sort of this really sort of most sacred element that we really tackled in this book that we're getting a lot of questions about, a lot of curiosities about. This idea that civil religion is a concept that sociologists study. They trace it back to a seminal article by Robert Bellah in 1967. And we went back and read that article, and I like to tell people it doesn't make a lot of coherence today. What Bellah is describing is a nation that's fairly homogenous, that can rally around the sort of transcendent symbols, values, etc., that are not necessarily sectarian, but have this sort of quasi-religious role in society. And then he warns in the article that, but careful, this could bleed into nationalism, and this doesn't work if if the society gets too pluralistic, etc. All those things that we're seeing today. So I would argue that even Bellah today, I don't think would subscribe to his same views on civil religion that are now assigned to him. But what we're really saying is it's much more problematic even from the beginning than we realized. And this is one of Brian's favorite stories, so I'll let him tell it.
Gotcha. So, I mean, yeah, when we go back and look at some of the examples that Robert Bellah is giving, I mean, one of the examples he gives, and it's one that we spend quite a bit of time in the book dealing with, is the addition of under God in the Pledge of Allegiance, which we just passed the 70th anniversary of. It was on Flag Day, June 14th, 1954, that President Dwight Eisenhower signed the law, the new congressional bill, to make it a law, putting under God into the Pledge of Allegiance. Bellah actually cites that as one of his examples of civil religion. But if you go back to the origin story, how did this under God phrase end up in the Pledge of Allegiance? We quickly realize that it's Christian nationalism. It comes from one sermon, which, side note, is an oppressive sermon. It gets an act of Congress signed by the United States president because of one sermon. Beau and I are still jealous that our sermons don't have that kind of impact. I mean, we're happy we'll remember the next day. I don't know, Beau, if anyone remembers your sermon, from yesterday still or not, but hopefully. But he goes to preach the sermon as a Presbyterian pastor in D.C., and he knows that President Eisenhower is going to be sitting in the church in Lincoln's pew on the Sunday closest to Lincoln's birthday. It's kind of a tradition that they would invite them. And he by the way, is a progressive Presbyterian pastor. He later marches with Martin Luther King Jr. He protests the Vietnam War, preaches against it from his congregation. That included the Secretary of Defense as a member of the congregation, right? I mean, he's a very progressive-minded Christian minister. He just wants us to also be a progressive Christian nation. And so he makes the argument the United States was founded on the Ten Commandments and the gospel of Jesus of Nazareth, and we're in this war with the godless Soviet Union, so we need to mark ourselves to stamp that we are God's chosen nation in this conflict, so we need to put under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. That was the whole point of the sermon, to convince the president to put under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. But we know it's not harmless, unifying civil religion, because he says the quiet part out loud. He says, well, some people might not be able to say this because they don't believe in God. So he says an atheistic American is a contradiction in terms. And then he goes on to call them spiritual parasites.
Wow.
So what he does, I know, right? First time we read the sermon, it was like, whoa, this is crazy. This is not civil religion. If someone gave that sermon today, we would call it Christian nationalism, because it is. He civically excommunicates a swath of Americans. Now, admittedly, it was very small swath back then, but a group of Americans as not real Americans based on their religious beliefs. Now, when Bellah wrote his argument, that's only a couple % of Americans, but it's grown significantly today. There's a much larger group of Americans, in fact, a full third of Americans don't identify as Christian now at all, that would be civically excommunicated from their beliefs. And so civil religion might have felt unifying at a time when we were mostly Christians in this country. It doesn't work in today's pluralistic democracy. And it was never completely innocent even back then. There was always some people that were being kicked out from being considered a real American. And so we pretty much just say that civil religion is Christian nationalism. I mean, it might be a friendlier, cuddlier, not quite violently storm the Capitol version, but it's still Christian nationalism, and it leads sometimes. It's that gateway drug to the harder versions of Christian nationalism.
So Christian nationalism sounds like one incarnation of civil religion. More broadly, should I think of civil religion as the antithesis of separation of church and state?
I mean, I think that's very fair. I mean, I think the whole point of civil religion and Christian nationalism, right, is this attempt to mark the nation religiously, and then to define who's a good American based on their religious beliefs. And so it really does cut against that. I mean, a lot of the effort at our founding to separate church and state are the things that we see those espousing Christian nationalism, or whether you call it civil religion or we call it Christian nationalism in the 50s, those are some of the things that they're doing. I mean, that's why we didn't have In God We Trust on our currency back then. And we didn't have Under God in the Pledge of Allegiance for 60 years. I mean, all of these different things that we were putting in the 50s and that people are pushing for today really do cut against the separation of church and state, to the point that I think the separation of church and state is the antidote that we need to Christian nationalism. It's the thing that helps protect both the state as well as the church.
Well, my perception is that the founding fathers were very conscious of what had gone wrong in Europe, right, with a lack of separation between church and state and the very tight alliance, if for lack of a better word, between, for instance, the Catholic Church and France, or, several other, examples there. Again, my perception, they intentionally left some of that out of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and things like that, and felt strongly about this separation of church and state.
It really is a remarkable experiment that the founders, particularly those like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, others that were pushing church separation. I mean, there were some that wanted to keep church and state together, like John Adams, Patrick Henry. Sometimes today, people like David Barton that push Christian nationalism, they tend to cite and quote from that Minority Report, right? Those that were on the losing side of the church-state debates. But it was a radical experiment that we decided to separate church and state. And James Madison, years after his presidency, wrote in a letter about this experiment and said it had protected the state from the sectarian violence and squabbles that you see in Europe, and it had helped churches and religion to flourish. Mm-hmm. I really think that was true, and that's one of the sad things about Christian nationalism, is that it really does harm both the church and the state.
I think too, when you bring in the American founding era, you look at the Enlightenment's influence on it, John Locke's thought, you certainly have this upholding of the idea of conscience as something that can't be coerced, can't be forced. And one of the things that the church, understood that theologically, right? My own denomination, we talk a lot about the freedom of the conscience. It's something that God gives to us. And so the state doesn't have the right to control or manipulate. And yet we see in Christian nationalism this desire to use state coercion in order to force at least the outward appearance of, religious practice, if not an inward change of the heart, right? So some of these laws that we're seeing passed in Oklahoma and Louisiana around the Bible, the Ten Commandments, we can't make people believe certain things, but we can certainly try to make people perform certain things when it comes to the role of Christianity in public life. That just seems to violate that core theological idea that the conscience is something that has to be persuaded, not coerced.
Mm. So another element in the book description says mainline Protestant congregations will likely recognize themselves in the overlooked expressions of Christian nationalism that pop up in the activities of both church and state. So what would you say are some of these overlooked expressions?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that unfortunately our churches do that really end up perpetuating this problem. And right, and part of the argument of the book is we need to look at ourselves more honestly. If we see Christianity as a whole problem, then we need to own our part in it and do something about what we can control. And so you look at, Brian and I do an interrogation of some mainline Protestant hymnals and the number of songs that are in there that are more nationalistic and patriotic than religious in any sort of way. You think about, we just had July 4th. You think about what kind of services happen in a lot of mainline churches around the country on July 4th. We can certainly talk about things like Boy Scout Sunday, and we can talk about the role of the flag in Christian sanctuaries. So I like to talk about if the sanctuary is an embassy of heaven, right? If what we're doing there is worshiping the God of all the nations, why is there any flag of any country in any sanctuary, right? Theologically, it doesn't make sense. But from the standpoint of civil religion or Christian nationalism, it makes a lot of sense. So there's a lot of things that mainline churches do that we have thought, well, that's not harmful, or that's actually positive, or that builds community up, or we're being good citizens of the country, but we aren't interrogating it theologically and seeing how problematic it is.
Hmm. So
yeah, I think that's right. I think also, regardless of what your faith tradition is, your denomination is, as you read through the book, if you come from a mainline denomination, you're going to find your people in there somewhere. We specifically kind of make a point anytime we're going through these stories to identify the clergy, the politicians in their traditions. And so we'd like to see more churches and denominations take a look at their own history and their own past roles in helping create Christian nationalism.
amen. Amen. So I'd like to read a portion from a couple of the endorsements of the book. This one is from Randall Ballmer, the renowned author and Dartmouth professor. He says the book reflects deep historical research, which is quite a compliment coming from him. So tell us about the research you did for the book.
Well, before we do that, can I actually just say a word about the endorsements? Because this is one of the things I think we're most proud of, right? The foreword is written by Adrian Thorne, who's the current senior minister at Riverside Church, the sort of cathedral of mainline Protestantism. And we knew that if we're going to get this book out there, we were going to need to have validation from theologians, historians, others who have studied Christian nationalism. So we have Andrew Whitehead, one of the primary sociologists looking at Christian nationalism. We have William Willimana, a mainline Protestant theologian, widely respected. And we have, like you said, Randall Ballmer, a historian whose credentials and work are just so impressive. So it's been very humbling to have this kind of attention, endorsements to the book from so many who frankly didn't have to, but chose to engage this project. We're really, really thankful for them. Brian, you want to say more about our research process and some of the digging we did?
Yeah, I would say there's a couple of things that I'd highlight on that. I mean, so one of the things, a lot of it was starting point was just asking the question of like, wait, so like I mentioned In God We Trust on the house chamber wall, right? Like asking the question, how did that end up there? Right? Something I had never heard. And so then we went looking and trying to find in the congressional record, why is that there? What were they saying at the time? Or asking questions like, all right, under God, I had seen a number of reports talking about the fact that it was a sermon, but now what did he actually say in the sermon? Let's go back and take a look at the actual words themselves, which turn out to be even more important what he said, not just the fact that, oh, there was a sermon and they passed the bill, right? And so that's a lot of what we were doing is we were asking these questions, how did something happen? Not just accepting the fact that something was in place, but looking at the timeline, looking at who was responsible behind it, what were people actually saying to justify what they were doing. And I think that was the research. It led us into the congressional record. It led us into, minutes from the organizing session of the National Council of Churches, and just, old newspaper accounts talking about, various issues as they're passed. And so, yeah, it was just, it is a wonderful compliment from Dr. Ballmer to get that. And because we spent a lot of time trying really hard to dig in and not just tell a story and make an opinion, but actually to teach people to learn, because we learned a lot through this book. We thought we had enough to write a book, and then we kept doing the research, and one of us would quickly, call the other one and be like, can you believe what so-and-so said here? Okay? And so we kept having those kind of like eureka moments throughout the book.
Very cool. Very cool. That must have been fun to uncover all of that. So here's another endorsement from Dr. Bradley Onishi, co-host of the Straight White American podcast. He says, this is a really important book because in an age where we talk a lot about Christian nationalism, they contribute something that I've not seen anywhere else. So what would you say are some of the more unique contributions that your book makes?
Yeah, so Brad Onishi is just an incredible religious studies scholar and podcaster who's trying to bring some of these conversations around Christian nationalism more into the public square and out of the academy. And we really respect his work and have been really, again, humbled by his endorsement of the book and having us on his podcast. I think a couple of things that we do that's unique is, again, not only the mainline piece of this and that different attention to this different tradition that is so influential historically and even present day. Mainline Protestants are roughly a third of American Christians, and we don't give them near the attention that evangelicals get. And frankly, we're impoverished in our understanding of religion and public life because of that. So we draw some attention there to an under-attended to constituency. Two, Christian nationalism can seem like such a big problem, right? How do we change perceptions of an entire country when it comes to this ideology? It can seem overwhelming. What can I, in my location as a pastor or as a member of a church, do? And one of the things we talk a lot about in the book is, at the end of the book, is here are some practical things you can do. It's not just read this, be mad about this. It's also not just go vent about this on Facebook or social media, because that might make you feel better, but it doesn't actually change anything. But we provide some very practical ways that individuals, congregations, even whole denominations can do some work to make things better when it comes to Christian nationalism.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, we've had the conversation about civil religion, which seems to be something that has sparked a lot of conversations. I think the book contributes beyond just thinking about mainline Protestants and the year role. And I also think hopefully we've added some new stories to the consideration of how we got to the world that we're in today, like the founding meeting of the National Council of Churches, which helped set the stage for a lot of what happened in government the few years after that, like, issues regarding in God We Trust on the House chamber wall and the creation of the chapel inside Congress and some other moments that, I mean, we had several stories that we share with people and they're like, I've never heard this story before. And it's really important for us to understand where we got, how we got here, and why some of the things we're going through aren't necessarily like brand new. Like we can all get really worked up and upset, and rightfully so, when former President Donald Trump was hawking the God Bless USA Bible, a few months ago. It's a really problematic sacrilegious treatment of the text, to stamp the American flag on it, to put the Pledge of Allegiance and the Constitution inside of it, and of course the lyrics to God Bless the USA. I mean, it's problematic on so many levels. He deserves criticism. And yet, as we'd already written the book, it had already gone to press, and we had even, like, in the book we talk about, can you imagine if Donald Trump did something like this? And the this that we were referring to was the fact that there had previously been a president who held an official ceremony at the White House to help launch a new Bible translation, the Revised Standard Version.
Wow.
This was coming from the mainline Protestant clergy who show up at the White House. They give President Truman the very first copy. He blesses it, if you will, endorses it, right? And this supports my foreign policy. And yet people don't know this story. I mean, that's one of the stories that even before the Trump moment, as we were just like in conversations with people, that was getting like feedback of, wow, that's crazy. I've never heard of this. It was a big White House moment. And so if we can get so focused in just like what's happening right now in this current political environment, and we lose that long-term perspective, I think it leads to, some really misguided interpretations of the moment we're in and how we got here. I mean, it's one of the things that we say in the book. We are living in the religious political timeline that mainline Protestants created. But they haven't reckoned with that, and the broader American culture hasn't reckoned with that. And so I hope people will see that as what this book adds to the broader conversations on Christian nationalism.
Well, as you know, I do a lot of interviews on books that are at the intersection of politics and religion or social justice and religion. And oftentimes I get frustrated because the book maybe will do a great job of analysis, how do we get here kind of a thing. But there's very little about, okay, what do we do about it? So I'm really glad to hear that your book addresses that very important part of the equation. And also that, to that point, Chalice Press has a small group study guide, to go along with the book. So can you tell us about that?
Yes. So the study guide was something that Chalice Press specifically asked us to make sure that we created. And, it's really exciting. We've already heard from a number of churches that are having small group studies with Baptizing America. And so we're glad to have the study guide there that gives a quick small summary of what happened in each chapter. I think it's 3 questions, kind of 3 or 4 questions to get the conversation moving. People can download that for free, by the way. Beau already mentioned our Substack newsletter, A Public Witness. So if you go to publicwitness.wardenway.org, at the top, there's a tab that says Baptizing America. Has more information about the book, but it also has a link to the PDF That's the study guide. And so we really wanted the two things from this. We have in the last chapter some of those step-by-step things that Beau just mentioned about, studying your own church and your own tradition, and kind of next steps on how you can make a difference to undo some of Christian nationalism in your own context, to detox from Christian nationalism. And then we also hope with that they'll have conversations about the book and have conversations about their next steps in their own setting. And so the study guide is a way of keeping that very practical, to not just learn our story, but now figure out how do we write a new story moving forward.
And I do think that the book, I mean, this is such a sensitive topic, especially in an election year. And so there's this catch-22 of more people want to have these conversations, but pastors and congregational leaders are maybe a little bit more suspicious or resistant to having these conversations because they worry about stoking controversy within their own community. So we wrote this, it's a gentle word, right? We're very sympathetic to the mainline tradition. We want this to be a resource that mainline churches, especially, and others too, can use in their congregations to have some of these conversations in a constructive way. So I think that the study guide certainly aids in that, but I think people who read the book will say that this is a book that's safe for church. Not that it won't challenge you, not that it won't cause you to look at some things differently, but if you leave this book, people leave this book angry and storming out of the room because you talked about it, preached on it, studied it, then we've done something wrong or they haven't read it right. And I'd be willing to bet on the latter than the former.
Very good. Very helpful. So what would you most like readers to take away from the book?
So I think the message is really simple, right? Christian nationalism is a sociological concept. It's a spectrum. We are all complicit in it in some way. And so what we need to do is acknowledge the problem, acknowledge our role within it, and get serious about what we can do about it. And this book will help you do all those things. It'll help you understand what it is and how you're complicit. It'll let you understand the history of it so you're more informed, and it'll help you know what you can do about it so you're not sitting there hopeless because nothing can be done. There's something that can be done, and for churches and Christians in America, we can do something about this.
Yeah, just to put a finer point on that, I mean, Christian nationalism is dangerous. It's a threat to our democracy. It's a threat to our Christian witness. It is a heresy. It's a heresy done in our name. And so we really want to be clear about that. We want people to learn how it happened so that we know how we can address it. And I think it's important that we don't just make it that story about blaming those other Christians over there. That we recognize that if you grew up in a white Christian church, in the United States, Christian nationalism is just in the air we breathe. We all have been, it's been so much a part of our culture that we now have to do that difficult work of separating the wheat from the chaff, to separating what's gospel and what's American. And we hope this book will help people to do that work.
So I have a lot of prospective authors in the audience for these interviews. What advice do you have for someone who's new and thinking about diving in to do some type of undertaking like you guys have?
The first thing that I would say is find what's missing from the conversation. I mean, that's the driving force behind this book. We looked around and noted book after book coming out on Christian nationalism, and they're all focused on white evangelicals or white Pentecostals. And often evangelical is in the title or the subtitle. And there's a missing part of the conversation. And so we didn't want to just write the same book that has been, even if we thought we could write the book better than some books, we don't have the names and the big publishing and all of that, that side honor. So we weren't going to have the big impact on conversation and getting people to think about Christian nationalism if we just wrote the same old. And I mean, I interview authors all the time as well. And so I've read a lot of books on Christian nationalism. And so, now when I pick up a book on Christian nationalism, I'm always hoping can you teach me something new? Otherwise, why am I reading this, right? So find that niche. Find what's not being said that's important. And I think that's the key driving thing. And that's what we just kept coming back to every time. I mean, that was our North Star on this project. We didn't allow ourselves to get sidetracked. There was a couple things when we do research and we'd get into it and be like, well, this isn't really a story about mainline Protestants, but it's interesting. Oh, well, I'm going to chuck that for now. Maybe I'll write about that on our Substack newsletter at some time. But it wasn't the focus of this project. And I think that's what really has made this book helpful. It's the reason why people find it fascinating, is interesting, is that we're saying something that was not being said.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and we get a lot of questions about co-authoring, right? Writing together. How did you do it? How did the relationship work? And I think a lot of people are suspicious. They presume, well, you're going to fight a lot, or one person's not going to carry their part of the load, or what if you disagree, or how do you find a common voice? Now, we've written together for years, so we kind of have each other's rhythms and voices down a little bit. We were able, our process was we would each take different chapters, draft part of it or all of it, swap it to the other. The other person would edit, revise, add in at their own volition, and then give it back for some final edits. And so we had a really good system, but it also made it a lot of fun to write with somebody. We could encourage each other. There was a couple of chapters. It's like, oh, this one is really difficult to get across the finish line, either because we had to do a lot more research. They were more research heavy in some than in others. Other topics were just really difficult to figure out how do we quite make sense of this. And so doing that with somebody actually added a lot to the project. I think we probably got it done sooner because we didn't let each other procrastinate. So it doesn't work for everyone. It worked for us. But I think if you can find a writing partner who will collaborate with you, and you can really work well with, do a project together, or at a minimum, have somebody who can help hold you accountable, whether it's a publisher, a coach, a mentor, somebody who you're checking in with so you're not on that writing island by yourself.
Makes a lot of sense. A lot of sense. So I know you've been in the midst of a book launch, but are there any future plans that you can say anything about?
I'm still hoping we can sell our movie rights here, but
no, yeah, I mean it's really hard. We've actually started talking about this. The book again has been met with quite some enthusiasm. So we've talked about what following up on it might look like. But I think right now, like Brian said, we saw a piece of this conversation that was missing, and we wanted to step into that gap. And we still don't think that gap has been adequately filled. The story still needs to be heard, so we're really focused on getting the message of this book out there. And we do continue to write, Brian more regularly than me, but at publicwitness.wordandway.org, all the things on religion and politics. So to the degree that listeners are interested just in that broader conversation, and they think we have something interesting to say, that's where you can find us more regularly.
And apparently there's going to be some stuff to write about this year about religion and politics. So that'll keep us busy at our newsletter.
Good. Well, congratulations on a fine piece of work and, diving into a very important subject that, as you said, have been overlooked. And wish you the best for the book. Again, the title is Baptizing America, How Mainline Protestants Helped Build Christian Nationalism. You can check it out at chalicepress.com. And Word and Way, is it WORDAND? WA.com?
Yes. Spell out the and.
Spell out the end.
Wordandway.org. And then I think our publisher would want us to name that if they order the book at chalicepress.com and use the promo code BA podcast for Baptizing America podcast, they can get a third off the cover price. So it's the cheapest way to buy it, and you can support the publisher directly by going to chalicepress.com with BA podcast as the promo code.
Excellent. While you're there, you can download the study guide.
That's right.
All right, guys. Well, thank you again.
Thanks, Brian.